I'm Roseanne Runta, the president of Carleton University, and it is a great pleasure to welcome you tonight to this lecture. First of all, I would like to say a few words about our fine faculty. In the Faculty of Public Affairs, Carleton really shines. We shine with all of the faculties, but public affairs was an idea that Carleton had many years before interdisciplinary studies were really popular. And they put together a really interesting group of departments. And a few years ago, we thought, is this really the right thing to have done? And everybody said, yes, it is the right thing to have been done. This is a good faculty. And that faculty created a research institute called COVE, the Center on Value and Ethics. And how many universities today are adding ethics to their curriculum, are suddenly waking up to the fact that maybe we should teach something about values. And Carleton was ahead of the game, as usual, working on research in value and ethics years before this became something that people realized was important. I think people always knew it was important. It just took a major crisis in America, south of the border, to make us actually realize it orally. In any case, we have this wonderful research institute with faculty doing cutting-edge research, which is totally interdisciplinary. And they ask us every day, in your field, in communications, in your field, in journalism, in your field, in engineering, what are your values? What ethics are you teaching? Are you thinking about? So they're bringing their questions to us all. They have graduate student colloquia, they have workshops, they bring wonderful speakers ranging from people from the United Nations to distinguished faculty from around the world. Very exciting work. And one of their most brilliant professors is Fiona Robinson. And she asked me not to say anything about her, but the department chair said that I should. So I'll just make her blush a tiny little bit. She is a specialist in international relations, in feminist theory, and in critical international relations theory. And her latest book, Globalizing Care, Ethics, Feminist Theory, and International Relations, is really a model, because I think that the United Nations and the world need to think about what women and women's values and the way they perceive the world can add to the way we treat values and ethics. So it's a great pleasure to introduce the person who's going to introduce the speaker. And here she is.
Thank you. Thank you very much, President Runte. Since my earliest days of studying political theory and international relations, there have always been a very few writers whose names are so ubiquitous, so frequently cited, so closely associated with hugely important theoretical positions, that I've had a hard time believing that there might actually exist somewhere a real, embodied human being that corresponds to that name. Until last year, when I had the pleasure of meeting him when we were both speakers at a conference on global justice in Philadelphia, Michael Walzer was one of those names for me. In fact, I must admit that even after meeting him at that conference, having dinner with him this evening, and as he sits here before me, ready to speak to you tonight, I'm still finding it a little bit hard to fathom. I think the name on the page will always have a life of its own for me. But I cannot deny that he is here, and I am delighted to be able to welcome him to Carleton University, to Ottawa, and to Canada this evening. So how to explain the iconic status of the name Walzer? Many of you will associate the name Michael Walzer with his most famous book, Just and Unjust Wars. First published in 1977, and now in its 4th edition, Just and Unjust Wars is the definitive contemporary work on the ethics and laws of war. Replete with historical examples, from the Athenian attack on Milos to the wars in the Balkans and Iraq, this classic work of political theory revived the centuries-old tradition of just war theorizing, showing us how and why consideration of ethics in the context of warfare was not only relevant, but necessary. The most recent edition of that book tells us in no uncertain terms that the 2003 war in Iraq can never be seen as a just war, since it was not a response to aggression or humanitarian intervention, but a war based on the cause of regime change. Aggression and massacre are legitimate causes of war, he writes, but the existence of regimes capable of aggression and massacre requires a different response. Now, Just and Unjust Wars was Michael Walzer's 5th single-authored book. Now, it is fair to say that 5 books is more than many of us will aspire to publish in our academic careers, especially if one of those books has global recognition as a modern classic and is translated into 8 languages. But for Michael Walzer, this was just the beginning. He went on to publish an astounding 24 more books, according to my count, that is. When you have that many, it's easy to lose count. Among these are the highly influential Spheres of Justice in 1983, Interpretation and Social Criticism in 1987, On Toleration in 1997, and his most recent edited book, Getting Out, Historical Perspectives on Leaving Iraq, in 2009. And this is just the books. In addition to these, he has written hundreds of articles on a great variety of topics, published in a diverse range of scholarly journals. He continues to be a regular contributor to Dissent, the magazine of politics and social culture of which he has been an editor since the early days of the civil rights movement. While there is, in many ways, enormous breadth and diversity in his work, common themes and approaches weave through his writing. Often classified as a communitarian thinker, Professor Walzer has, over the course of his career, defended a minimalist view of universal morality, a thin morality, if you will, that can only be thickened or made more substantive in the context of particular communities with particular histories, traditions, and visions of the good. I think that the best way for me to explain this is through his own words. If you will indulge me for a moment, I will read a short passage, which is a quote from an interview with Michael Walzer, published in 1997. In that interview, he said, "There was a very dramatic moment, a wonderful moment in 1989, when there appeared on American television pictures of people marching through the streets of Prague. They were carrying signs that said truth and justice. And I looked at those signs and was immediately in agreement. And it seems to me that the way to explain the agreement is to notice what we weren't agreeing on. The marchers weren't demanding that I accept the coherence theory or the correspondence theory of truth. They just were saying that they didn't want to be lied to by their political leaders. I also don't want to be lied to by my political leaders. The signs about justice didn't require that I accept utilitarian equality or the difference principle or whatever. The marchers didn't want the secret police knocking on their doors at 3 in the morning. And when you define truth or justice in those terms, I can march in that demonstration immediately and carry those signs. I can join that march, but I also have my own parade, where truth and justice take on much more substantive and thicker meanings." Notable too in Professor Walzer's writings is his sustained commitment to grounding his philosophical arguments with historical and anthropological illustrations, subtly teaching us from the past while warning us against the hubris of presentism. I am hopeful that we will be treated to his insights on history in the lecture this evening. Michael Walzer is currently Emeritus Professor in the School of Social Sciences at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. He has been at the Institute since 1980. This position followed 14 years of teaching in the Department of Government at Harvard University. It is my understanding that at Harvard in the 1970s, Professor Walzer taught a course with his colleague, Robert Nozick. The course was called Capitalism versus Socialism. It was a debate between the two thinkers. I can only imagine how extraordinary and lively that class must have been. Described in a book review in the Boston Globe as a national treasure, we are delighted and honored to have him on loan to us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Michael Walzer.
you, Fiona. I think I'd better have that closer. My subject today is trying political leaders, and I don't mean trying out political leaders in advance to see if we're likely to find their leadership disastrous, though that might be a good thing to do if we could find a way of doing it. In politics, judgment doesn't have to be, and often can't be, after the fact. But it is post facto judgment that I'm interested in today. My subject is the morality and wisdom of putting political leaders on trial after we have endured their leadership and perhaps their crimes. Political trials have a long history, and the judgments we make of the procedures and verdicts are highly contested. I'm going to try to suggest a comparative politics of political trials. They have a very different character and very different purposes in different national and international settings, and like all trials, their justice and wisdom depend on their character and purpose. I'm going to consider 4 kinds of political trials, all from the modern period. I'm not competent to discuss the Greek and Roman precedents. The 4 are: first, revolutionary trials, like those that took place in 1649 and 1793 in London and Paris. Second, the show trials that are part of a political purge, like the Moscow trials of the 1930s. Third, post-war trials, like those held in Nuremberg in 1945 and 6. And fourth, what I will call post-election trials, like those recently proposed in my country for leading members of the Bush administration. I don't know if you have had similar issues here. I don't think you have had political leaders quite as bad as some of ours. So I should stress at the beginning that my perspective is that of a political theorist, not a lawyer. The legality of political trials is often dubious, but that's not my central concern. It's possible, I think, for trials to be legally dubious, but morally and politically right. And it's also possible for them to be perfectly legal, but radically imprudent. So let's begin with the trials of Charles I and Louis XVI by the revolutionaries who overthrew them. These are critical moments in early modern political history, our political history, for we are citizens of the states that those revolutionaries founded. We are the heirs of those trials. Kings had been killed before. Indeed, untimely death was a regular feature of kingship all through its history, but they had been killed by single assassins, like Henry IV of France, or murdered in corners out of sight, like Richard II in Pontefract Castle. When Oliver Cromwell said of Charles that we will cut off his head with the crown on it, he was aiming not simply at the death of a king, but at the death of monarchy itself. And that required, he thought, a public accounting, an indictment and a trial that challenged the legal inviolability of kings and treated this king as a public official, answerable to the public, as capable of committing a crime as any other subject of the realm. Now, not all the revolutionaries wanted to put the king on trial. The debate in France over what to do with Louis raised issues that reappeared in the run-up to the Nuremberg trials and are worth considering in some detail. The Jacobins opposed a trial, arguing that Louis had committed no crimes to which the law reached. His only crime, said Saint-Just, was to have been king. And that was obviously not a crime under the laws of the old regime. No one can reign innocently, said Saint-Just. The verb is crucial here. But in fact, he wasn't interested in the guilt or innocence of Louis. What he and Robespierre believed was that ruling as a king, reigning, was an act of war against the people the king ruled. This was an unjust war, a war of aggression. But Louis was not, first of all, a criminal. He was, first of all, an enemy. He was, said Robespierre, an enemy of the people. And I believe that this phrase has its origin in the French debates. And since he was dangerous even in captivity, military necessity required that he be killed. He couldn't be treated as a prisoner of war. The legal phrase benevolent quarantine for the duration comes later, but it describes very well what the Jacobins thought impossible in the case of kings, and what the Bolsheviks still thought impossible in 1917, when they acted on the Jacobin doctrine, though with their own special ruthlessness, killing the Tsar and all his family. No Jacobin suggested anything quite like that in 1793. Like Cromwell, Robespierre and Saint-Just wanted to kill the king with his crown on, but they were not interested in a public indictment. They thought a trial was something owed only to citizens, and soon enough they would be putting a lot of citizens on trial. But they saw no need to make a case, to persuade men and women who had been ruled by kings for centuries that this king had betrayed them. It was self-evident that kings and patriots were in a state of war. The underlying assumption of the Jacobin argument was that Louis was not a Frenchman, literally, not a member of the nation or a citizen of the state, or most importantly, a party to the social contract. Kings and aristocrats, too, belonged to an international class of parasites and predators who took no responsibility for the well-being of the people they ruled because they were not of the people. And so they had no claim on the protection of the revolutionary state that the people had created. Once the King of France had arrogantly proclaimed that he was the state, l'état c'est moi. Now the Jacobins proclaimed that the king was stateless. I'm not sure that that description, despite its fierceness, was entirely inaccurate. Louis himself might have agreed that he had never signed on to the social contract. Nonetheless, it was a dangerous description, since it could easily be extended to other enemies of the people. I much prefer the Girondins, who were the chief advocates of a trial for Louis and who carried the day, though they didn't get exactly the trial that they wanted. They argued that Louis was indeed and obviously a Frenchman. He was Louis Capet, a public servant who had committed the crime of treason. He had conspired with and actively assisted enemy armies attacking the Republic. And of course, the law reached to this crime. Even under the old regime, treason was a criminal act, though it was thought then, mistakenly, that the king could not be a traitor, since treason was defined as a crime against the king. But the king had always been, in fact, an officer of the people, and treason was always a betrayal of the people, and not merely of its chief officer. The real innovation of the revolutionaries was to deny the king's inviolability. If the law's reach extended to the crime, then they insisted it extended to the criminal. All Frenchmen were equal before the law. This was an ex post facto equality, but the Gironde was willing to live with that, since equality, its members thought, was natural and eternal, even if it was new to French law. It followed from the Girondin argument that Louis should be accorded all the rights of a French citizen accused of a crime, that he should be represented by an attorney, that he and his attorney should know the charges against him, see the documentary evidence collected by the prosecution, and be allowed to question hostile witnesses and to call friendly witnesses to the stand. What justice truly demands, argued Condorcet, the leading intellectual of the Gironde, what justice truly demands is that the general principles of jurisprudence in favor of the accused should be preserved or even extended. This sort of thing, Robespierre responded, was a sign of delicacy. The term was disdainful. Delicacy in the case of kings demonstrated nothing more than a lack of revolutionary energy. Robespierre and his friends called Louis the last king. Their politics was resolutely forward-looking. Condorcet and his friends called Louis the former king. Their politics aimed at a just reckoning with the past. But the trial that the Girondins wanted was also intended to have consequences for the future. In a sense, it was a show trial, and indeed a splendid spectacle. The king judged by his subjects, his peers. Louis Capet standing before the court, exposed as a mere man, all the mythic masks of kingship torn off, but charged with crimes he had committed when he wore the crown. This could not help but be, Condorcet believed, a great moment in the education of the human race. But if it was to make that kind of showing, it had to be a real trial. Its educational value depended on its procedural integrity. In a book that I wrote in 1974 defending the trial and execution of Louis XVI, I adopted what was pretty much the Girondin position. Revolutionary justice is defensible whenever it points the way to everyday justice. That's the maxim that marks off morally legitimate trials from prescriptions and terror. The legitimacy of the king's trial lies first in its resemblance to an ordinary judicial proceeding. Condorcet was entirely right to argue that the nearer the resemblance, the better the trial, the more just for the king, and, not inconsistently, the more effective for the revolutionaries. But justice in revolution cannot be measured in a purely formal way, for what is usually at stake is not the validity of this or that procedure. There was no disagreement in the Revolutionary Assembly as to what constituted a fair trial. What was at stake was the status of the men and women involved. In the case of the king, what was at issue was whether he was justiciable at all. And here, the whole purpose of the revolution was to change the law, not merely to apply it. And it's obvious that the proposed changes have to be defended in political and moral, not in legal terms. Hence, the second and more important defense of Louis's trial is simply the claim that to turn kings into citizens is to advance the cause of justice. Now, the trials that accompany political purges are also show trials, but their educational value depends, in contrast to the revolutionary trials, on their lack of procedural integrity. The aim is to inspire fear among all opponents and all potential opponents of the regime, and so it is necessary that everyone watching the trial understand that what Condorcet called the general principles of jurisprudence in favor of the accused have no place here. The law offers no protection. If you are accused, you are dead. But then why go to the trouble of organizing a trial? The purge metaphor doesn't suggest the need for any kind of judicial procedure. Corrupt elements are simply removed from the body politic. Indeed, many enemies of the regime in the Soviet Union in the 1930s were simply arrested and shot. And something like that has probably happened on a much smaller scale in Iran today. Disappearances of this lethal sort certainly have an educational effect. But the organizers of a purge want something more than this, which they apparently think only a trial can provide. Considerable care went into the preparation of the Moscow trials, and we can see something of the same care in Tehran today, where it is similarly difficult to understand. What point can there be in organizing a trial if the procedures that constitute a trial are ignored? Fear can obviously be produced in other ways. I think that it's the confession that is crucial in the purge trials. Procedural justice is rendered unnecessary by the abject confession of the accused. But these two have different purposes. Procedural justice, in the case of Louis, say, was meant to convince the political public that kings were as liable to prosecution as any other citizens. They were public officials who had, in fact, committed crimes. Confession is meant to degrade and disgrace former revolutionary leaders accused of oppositional tendencies. The charges and then the confessions are unbelievable, contradictory, absurd, and precisely for that reason, the recitation by the defendant of his crimes is an act of public self-abasement and political self-destruction. He isn't guilty so much as helpless, beaten, cowardly, irrelevant. The sabotage, espionage, and treason to which he confesses are inventions of the regime, which require a radical rewriting of history. And the message that the trial delivers is that the regime can transform the past in any way it likes and is therefore in firm control of the future. It can do anything. Its opponents can do nothing but acquiesce. The trial provides an occasion for their ritual acquiescence to their own political oblivion. But this can't be the whole story. Stalin insisted that confessions be extorted by torture, if necessary, from tens of thousands of his victims who were never brought to trial, who were simply shot or transported to the camps without any public appearance. And their confessions were sent to the archives, marked to be kept forever. Robert Tucker, the biographer of Stalin, offers a psychological explanation of Stalin's insistence. Insecure in his paranoia, Stalin needed this confirmation that the people he was purging were indeed enemies of the revolution. But this is especially odd, since he certainly knew that the hostile acts described in the confessions had never taken place. Everyone else should have known that too. And yet the charges and the confessions that I just called unbelievable were believed by many people. Not only by faithful communists prepared to believe anything, and not only by clever philosophers like Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who argued dialectically that even if the charges were factually false, they were politically true. Independent observers, journalists from many countries, liberal and conservative intellectuals, diplomats like the American ambassador Joseph Davies, watched or read about the trials and concluded that the defendants must be guilty of something, as if political defeat was itself a sign of guilt. Hence, it was really important to insist, as a few intellectuals like John Dewey did, that the purge trials were not trials at all, for nothing was being tried, every outcome was known in advance, and all the evidence was made up. The failure of so many politicians and activists, especially, but not only on the left, to join in this insistence is a lasting shame. Of course, purge trials do bear some resemblance to real trials, else they wouldn't work at all. Confession is a common way of giving up procedural rights in exchange for other benefits, sometimes life itself. But the resemblances are superficial, and it is still very hard to accept the fact that so many intelligent people were fooled by the Moscow trials. The absurdity of the charges, the groveling confessions, the broken men in the dock, this was terrorism in the guise of justice. Justice after a war is commonly called victor's justice. It resembles the justice done or attempted by triumphant revolutionaries. And after World War II, it prompted similar debates, though with one important difference. Many of those who opposed the establishment of the Nuremberg tribunals did so out of a strong commitment to procedural justice. Their arguments were different from those of the Jacobins, though their conclusion was similar. Their conclusion was that the leading Nazis should be shot as soon as they were captured. A fair trial, in accordance with British and American principles, was more than they deserved, but even more importantly, it was unlikely that any trial would be or would be seen to be fair. The British War Cabinet worried that since, quote, the result would be a foregone conclusion, these proceedings would tend to bring judicial procedure into contempt. As Gary Bass writes in his very fine study of war crimes tribunals, which is my chief source here, the British showed an unwillingness to compromise the integrity of their traditional judicial procedures and a willingness to be blunt about their unwillingness. The bluntness is evident in Churchill's proposal that the Allies produce a list of the 50 or 100 leading Nazis, and then, I'm quoting Churchill, when any of these people fall into the hands of any of the armed forces of the United Nations, the nearest officer of the rank of Major General will forthwith convene a court of inquiry, not for the purpose of determining the guilt or innocence of the accused, but merely to establish the fact of his identity. Once identified, the said officer will have the outlaw shot to death within 6 hours and without any reference to higher authority. I should add that Churchill responded with high indignation to Stalin's proposal at the Tehran Conference in 1943 that at least 50,000 Germans should be proscribed and shot. The British Parliament and public, he told Stalin, will never tolerate mass executions. Churchill aimed to kill no more than 100. There would then be trials for all the people he called subordinate war criminals, preferably in the country in which their crimes had been committed. Despite the designation of these people as criminals, the outcome of their trial was presumably not a foregone conclusion. Churchill's outlaw plays something of the same part as Robespierre's enemy of the people. Both terms describe people who are somehow beyond the law. With regard to the Nazis, Anthony Eden wrote, "The guilt of such individuals is so black that they fall outside the scope of any judicial process. Their fate," Sir John Simon, the Lord Chancellor, told the cabinet, "their fate is a political, not a judicial question." That was also the Jacobin view of the king's fate, though they expressed it in quasi-military terms and without, obviously, the delicacy of the cabinet's legalism. In the United States, Henry Morgenthau represented the Jacobin position, and Henry Stimson, with the support of Felix Frankfurter, was the Girondin, working out the position that Robert Jackson defended at the London Conference in 1945 and then expressed with great eloquence in his opening statement for the prosecution in Nuremberg. That 4 great nations, flush with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. The reason for the tribute was twofold. First, the Americans had a strong commitment, often called legalistic, though it seems to me deeper than that word suggests, to the value and integrity of judicial procedures, and in contrast to British jurists, they were optimistic about the possibility of sustaining procedural integrity in a post-war court. They believed, as Otto Kirchheimer has written, that Victor's justice, quote, did not exclude judicial freedom of appreciation of the role of individual German leaders. And indeed, that freedom led to acquittals as well as to guilty verdicts at Nuremberg. The Nuremberg results were not a foregone conclusion. And second, the Americans believed, much like Condorcet, in justice as moral education. Only a trial, Stimson argued, only the detailed testimonies and the massive documentation that a trial would require would, quote, demonstrate the abhorrence which the world has for the Nazi system of terror and bring home to the German people our determination to extirpate it and all its fruits forever. Now, I'm not going to argue that Nuremberg was a successful demonstration, just as I didn't argue that the trial of Louis was an effective as well as a great moment in the education of humankind. Certainly, the impact of Nuremberg was resisted in Germany at the time and in some quarters ever since, though I believe that the trials of Nazi war criminals have had significant, if hard to measure, effects, legally, politically, and morally. Curiously, perhaps, they have had the greatest effect where they were legally most dubious. This is the argument that my old friend and colleague Judith Schklar made when she discussed the Nuremberg trials in her 1964 book, Legalism. Crimes against humanity was the most innovative of the charges brought at Nuremberg. Kirchheimer called the legal formula problematic, and if you read the lawyer's arguments in 1945, it was certainly that. But Schklar predicted correctly that this was the charge that would resonate over the years. By contrast, in the years since 1945, no one has been brought to trial for the crime of aggression. I don't think that any trials have even been suggested for the crime of aggression, though the criminality of aggression was established in international law well before the Nuremberg trials by the Kellogg-Briand Pact in the 1920s. It's astonishing to remember that there were lawyers and jurists in Britain and the United States who thought that the Nazi leaders could be tried only for crimes against humanity committed in the occupied countries. They argued Bass reports that the killing and persecution of German Jews was protected by German sovereignty. These crimes were protected not in the sense that they were permitted or justified by sovereignty, but in the sense that they did not fall within the jurisdiction of an international court. But this claim was rejected by the prosecution and then by the Nuremberg judges. Sovereignty does not extend to mass murder. Today, it is widely, though not universally, accepted that a government engaged in the massacre of its own citizens can be overthrown by foreign military forces, and that its officials can then be brought to trial in either a national or an international court. Nuremberg provides the crucial precedent, pointing the way, like Louis' trial, to everyday justice, though the examples of Rwanda and Darfur suggest that we are not there yet. Now, imagine the following case. A group of political leaders who have been in power for almost a decade lose an election. Many supporters of the winning party believe that the policies of the defeated leaders were criminal. They involved the violation of specific laws, domestic and international. These victors want to put the defeated leaders on trial. And that, they claim, is a perfectly reasonable and entirely legal thing to do. It isn't revolutionary justice. Since the turnabouts in democratic elections are not revolutionary, the regime is not being changed, only the government. The Constitution, the whole legal system is intact. No new understandings of agency and responsibility are required to justify the trials that are now proposed. Nor would this be victors' justice, as at Nuremberg. First of all, because competitive elections are not like wars, even when we use the language of war to talk about them. We run campaigns, we try to outflank our opponents on the right or the left, we design strategies and tactics, we maneuver for advantage, but we are not, in fact, fighting. And second, post-election trials wouldn't be victor's justice because the trials would be conducted by independent judges who are not newly installed and who are not actively part of the winning party. The decision to bring charges or to launch an investigation that might result in charges being brought would have to be taken in the United States by the Attorney General, who is a political appointee and whose appointment is politically very sensitive. Nonetheless, the trials themselves could be and would be, so their advocates claim, insulated from partisan politics. Nor, finally, would the proposed trials be anything like a purge. The charges would not be absurd, and the defeated leaders would not be tortured, their families would not be threatened, they would not be forced to confess. Indeed, it's most unlikely that they would even think about confessing. So, if revolutionary trials and post-war trials can be distinguished from purges, and if they can be justified morally and politically, as I've tried to suggest they can be, then surely all the more so can post-election trials be justified. In fact, however, the a fortiori argument doesn't work, or works in the other way. It is easier to justify the trials of political leaders after the major break of a triumphant revolution or a victorious war than it is after the minor break of a democratic election. Trying kings for treason or prime ministers and war ministers for aggression or for crimes against humanity may involve understandings of treason, aggression, and humanity different from those that once prevailed. But these understandings have been vindicated by revolution and war. The trials enact a new consensus about domestic or international justice. But there is no new consensus after a democratic election. Instead, the defeated party in opposition now defends what it did in government, insists on the rightness of its own policies and ideology, and plans for the time when it can return to power and do the same things again. Democracy depends on the willingness of political leaders to go into opposition and on their expectation that they will, or at least that they might one day, return to power. We call this rotation in office. And though it doesn't occur on a regular schedule, it does regularly occur. By contrast, kings and Republican politicians do not alternate in office. First Louis XVI, then Robespierre, then Louis again. Well, actually, the Restoration and the revolutions of 1830 and 1848 did produce a rotation, something like that, but not as a settled constitutional arrangement. Nor did we want, after World War II, to see a Nazi regime ever again in power. First Hitler, then Adenauer, then Hitler again. Endings like those of 1793, the year of the king's execution, and 1945 are meant to be definitive. But endings like those of 2000 or 2008, when one political party and then the other was toppled from power, are not in any sense definitive. The truth about democratic elections is that the stakes are fairly low compared to the stakes in revolutions and wars. I don't mean that critically important questions about public policy aren't sometimes decided democratically through party politics and election campaigns, but they are rarely decided in any definitive or conclusive way. The argument goes on after the decision has been made, and so do the arguing politicians go on. Sometimes they go on and on and on. Perhaps if the electoral defeat is decisive, the defeated leaders will retire from politics, though usually with the hope of being called back. But their place will be taken by younger leaders with many of the same ideological commitments. The stakes are low in this precise sense No one expects to be killed or imprisoned after they lose an election. Aristotle speaks of the relationship among democratic citizens as friendship. That may seem to us, or it certainly seems to many people in my country, too strong a term. But there does have to be some sense among the citizens that they are engaged in a common project. And there has to be some readiness to recognize the good faith of fellow citizens who disagree about how that project ought to be pursued. Of course, we also recognize individual greed, power lust, and ideological zeal that seem to leave no room for the common project. But with regard to critical policy debates, it's important to assume, it's important to be able to assume that all the parties have the general welfare in mind. And so it isn't a disaster if our opponents win this time, because they won't do anything absolutely awful, and they won't always win. That's how democracy works. All political victories and all political defeats are partial and temporary. They don't put our common project in radical jeopardy. As the saying goes, you win some and you lose some. So we should think very carefully before we do anything that raises the stakes of democratic politics. And winning an election and putting your opponents on trial would certainly raise the stakes. There's a narrowly prudential argument against doing that, in addition to the broader prudential argument that I've just been making. If we raise the stakes for them, they can raise the stakes for us. Paraphrasing Saint-Just, we might say that no one can rule innocently. There will always be reasons for a trial. There will always be political maneuvers or policy decisions that violate the law or that can be made to look as if they violate the law. And once the game gets serious in that way, anyone holding office would have a very strong incentive to do whatever was necessary to win the next election. Winning some and losing some would then look like a fool's politics. It would be very dangerous, I think, to start down that path. Now, the opposing argument, obviously, is the argument of the Gironde in the French Revolution. Political leaders are not and should never be inviolable. We are a political community of equal citizens. No one is exempt from the law. Now, that's certainly true with regard to what we might call personal crimes. A president or a prime minister who takes bribes or who commits rape or murder should be impeached or defeated and then put on trial without regard to his or her office. But it may make sense, I think it does make sense, to treat political crimes differently. Impeachment should be possible here too, but trials are best avoided. When Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, when Franklin Roosevelt ordered the internment of Japanese American citizens, when Bush and Cheney authorized the torture of suspected terrorists, they were acting for what they thought was the public good, not for any personal good. And the best way of dealing with actions of that sort, if we believe them to be wrong, is to send the rascals home in the next election and then to repudiate their policies. But we might reconsider here the British position of 1945, not the argument about shooting captured leaders, but the other argument, which may be more relevant to post-election than to post-war politics. The fate of democratically elected leaders is, as Sir John Simon said, a political, not a judicial question. It has to be worked out one way or another through the political process. But the people that Churchill called subordinate criminals could conceivably be brought to trial for specific illegal actions without dangerously raising the stakes of democratic politics. I'm not easy with this position. I'm not sure it's my position, since it violates the principle of equality before the law. But the violation is common. Consider the trials that followed the My Lai massacre during the Vietnam War and the abuse of prisoners at Abu Ghraib. And it may serve, even if inadequately, the rule of law. It targets only people who are not subject to democratic, that is, electoral repudiation. So perhaps we are not a community of absolutely equal citizens. If I capture and torture somebody, I should be tried and punished. If the president orders that done, not to somebody, but to many bodies, acting, so he says, in the name of national security, his only punishment is political defeat. We should vote against him whenever we can, as soon as we can. But there is a line here that must be carefully drawn. I'm not exactly sure how to draw it, but I'll conclude my argument with this drawing effort. If the president's violations of the law or the Constitution aim at the creation of a tyrannical regime, if it is his own political enemies that he's arresting and torturing and not enemies of the Republic, or if he's systematically confusing these two, then we have to find a definitive way to defeat and overthrow him. And as part of that process, or after it, a full-scale trial might be the best available means, not only of doing justice, but of demonstrating, to paraphrase Henry Stimson, our determination to extirpate tyranny and all its fruits forever. But we have not yet had trials like that, and we shouldn't imagine holding them until necessity forces our hand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Walzer. I have no doubt there will be many questions. So there are 2 microphones, and we invite you to come to the microphone and ask a question.
Mr. Walzer, that was very provoking. Thought-provoking, provoking in other ways.
I can't hear you.
The specific question I want to ask you is, what about a president who tries to set up an imperial presidency, thereby systematically undermining the powers granted to other branches of government?
Okay, the president who tried to do this lost an election and walked away from Washington. So he didn't quite succeed in creating a presidency that was impervious to democratic constraint. I think the effort to increase the power of the presidency, like any effort that one might imagine to increase the power of the Supreme Court or to increase the power of Congress, should be, if we think it wrong, it should be resisted politically. I don't think that a judicial process is the right way of dealing with efforts of that kind.
I guess we'll go back and forth.
I noticed an interesting focus in your speech on trying people after they lose an election, but a lot of your speech was in the context of the recent American elections and I suppose George Bush. I heard discussions regarding trying the political leaders before the election even happened, and I'm fairly sure that such discussions would have happened after the elections, even if the Republicans had won. What do you say to that?
Well, it was certainly something that political theorists and public intellectuals could argue about, but there was no chance of trying political leaders if the Attorney General was a member of their party and acting on their behalf. So it wasn't an actual issue. The only way you could bring political leaders to trial is after they have been politically defeated. Now, for personal crimes like Clinton's lying about his sexual engagements, you can try impeachment, and conceivably, had Clinton been impeached, he then would have been brought to trial. But those were not political crimes, although the effort to impeach him was a political effort, since we all knew that these were not impeachable crimes. So it's hard to avoid politics in these kinds of cases, and I think it's better to embrace politics and to say, this is the way we change policy. You defeat a political party or a political leader, you send him home, and you repudiate his policies, and you appoint people who are committed to a different set of policies. And that's the way the democratic process works and ought to work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Walzer. I'm not going to talk about the American presidency, so don't worry. I wanted to know, since you talked about a minimal conception of the good, and you often talk about in your writings grounding political and moral theory in tradition and history, is that if we take that path, does it commit us to a sort of anti-realism? If it does, how do we justify thick conception we have of justice outside our borders, since certainly these trials will concern foreign leaders? And if it commits us to a form of realism, then what need do we really have to give tradition so much importance if we can flesh out moral facts? So.
I think you're asking a big meta-ethical question, which I'm not sure I understand, and I'm sure a lot of other people won't understand the significance of this question. So can you tie it to an example?
Oh, sure. If we take, I suppose, the trial of Slobodan Milosevic, for instance, it's arguably slightly less controversial than Nuremberg, or slightly less patently obvious of what we thought of what happened. And if we're going to say that there are universal norms, then it seems difficult to have to justify them with tradition, since you mentioned that's how we're going to flesh out a substantial view of justice. So what need do we have of tradition in that case? But if we give tradition an important role to define notions of justice and so on and so forth, then it seems that we have an impossibility to justify to those outside of our tradition our concepts of justice or good or right, so on and so forth.
This is an argument that came up most clearly, not at Nuremberg, but in the Tokyo trials after World War II, where a group of American jurists and lawyers created a trial based on natural law, and not, as at Nuremberg, on existing international law augmented by this notion of crimes against humanity, which had a history, although not a very clear-cut history. But in Japan, there's a very famous dissent by an Indian judge who simply said that the natural law arguments of the American lawyers, many of whom were Catholic, simply meant nothing to the Japanese public, who were watching and listening and supposedly being educated by these trials. And I'm inclined to agree that it would have been better to find a different way of grounding those trials. It would have been better to look for a way that could have readily been naturalized into Japanese political and legal culture. In the case of Milosevic, after all, murder and even mass murder are crimes under Serbian law. So it wasn't a spectacular innovation. It wasn't an appeal outside of Serbian legal and moral consciousness to bring Milosevic on trial. What was crucial in making that trial persuasive was in proving that he had done what we all think he did. Because if that could be proven, there would not be a lot of people in Serbia prepared publicly to defend what he did. And if they tried to defend what he did, they would not be talking within the Serbian legal tradition.
Yes, Professor Walzer. Like Professor Robinson, I cut my political theory teeth reading much of your work, so I'm sorry to say that what you've argued today has floored me. I'm a displaced American living in Canada now half of my life and paying some attention to the Bush and Obama regimes. And you undoubtedly know that the impunity for torture has metastasized since September 11th. I think that was part of the reference to the imperial presidency. That the arguments in favor of the public justification for torture in the United States has traveled around the world, threatening to undermine the post-World War II regime of Nuremberg and international human rights in a really fundamental way, it seems to me. So what I find curious is that you think about this matter apparently, or in your lecture at least, only thought about it from the point of view of prudence in an electoral democracy, when I would have thought you would have had to take into account human rights. And in particular, I would have thought you would have taken into account human rights, given your conception of human rights is based on reiterated empirical universals. If that's what the stuff of human rights is, then the sort of challenge that's posed by the American regimes is really fundamentally important, in which case I would want to make the argument that a political trial in these sorts of circumstances is perhaps just as important as it was post-World War II, because now it's a matter of trying to recuperate or reorient the imperial American regime back to some sort of commitment to human rights. So I wonder what you would say in response to that.
Okay, well, that's the big argument, obviously. First of all, I think if you were to look closely at America's wars in Korea and Vietnam, or any other country's wars anywhere, you would find that torture was not an uncommon practice. The only difference that was the Bush administration's effort to give it a legal basis. Right. And to acknowledge that they were doing it. You could say there's something meritorious about that in a democracy, actually to try to defend this practice which all of us believe is indefensible. So the real question is, should that effort at legalizing torture be repudiated in some legal way rather than just in a political way? And we could repudiate it in a legal way or a legalistic way by, for example, disbarring the lawyers who wrote the torture memos. Now that, I think, would be a fine thing to do. It doesn't raise the issues that I dealt with here. We could also, as we did with My Lai and Abu Ghraib, we could go after the actual perpetrators. And that makes us all very uncomfortable because they were doing what they were told to do. And In My Lai, you went after the perpetrators and maybe one level up the chain of command, but you didn't go any higher. And Abu Ghraib, I don't think we went much above the first level. So exactly where to stop, that is, I think, it has to be a prudential question, simply because democracies are fragile political regimes. And I have a very strong sense of their fragility. I made this argument in front of a group of lawyers, one of whom accused me of defending the political elites because he thought I was willing to sacrifice the low-level perpetrators. Well, I don't mean to defend the political elites. I mean to defend all of us against what happens when the competition between political elites gets deadly.
May I just make one more comment in response to that? Abdullah al-Malki, who was one of our Canadian citizens who was tortured in the Middle East at the behest of the Canadian and the American governments for something like 8 months, wanted to be here this evening, but he couldn't be because he had to be in Toronto. I wonder if you would feel comfortable making this argument in his presence, that those who are most responsible for fundamental human rights breaches and the breaking of his body should not be put on trial simply in the name of oiling the gears of electoral democracy.
No, I'm not oiling the gears, and I would certainly make this argument in the presence of anybody who wanted to listen to it. I'm not oiling the gears. I'm trying to preserve a regime which is the best regime that we have. And I'm not proposing simply to let these guys go. I want to send them home in disgrace. I want to repudiate their policies in the strongest way. I want to replace them by a new set of policies grounded in strong legal and moral arguments. That's, I think, the right way to deal with these kinds of issues. I would not have put Roosevelt on trial. Look what he did to thousands of Japanese families. I would not have put him on trial. But I would have wanted a severe political, you have to imagine an opponent who would have defended the Japanese Americans. This wasn't available in the United States in 1944. But I would have wanted a political repudiation of that policy. And I would have certainly have said that in front of Japanese Americans.
Okay, I'd like to continue, but I'll concede.
Yes, I'd like to put to you that there's an alternative to simply going after the previous regime when you think they were doing something illegal and immoral, and that is to appeal to an objective international body. And I'm thinking here of Section 20 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, and I'm thinking any propaganda for war shall be prohibited by law. And I'm thinking that under Bush, of course, nothing of this could ever be allowed to happen because they have the power to stop anyone bringing them to International Criminal Court. But under the Obama administration, he would be able, maybe he'd be assassinated if he did, but if he would be able to change that policy. And it wouldn't then be a case of one group going too hard on the previous group. It would be a case of where the new leaders would just have to be careful that they paid attention to international law and didn't engage in propaganda for an unjust war. And that's where for the judges to determine, just to give that law some teeth. I wonder what you say to that. And let's put it this way. Look, if I were to have a petition that the United States, if you were to be presented with a petition that said, Michael Walzer, would you sign this? And the petition said, we want a trial under the basis of this section to take place over the Bush administration people who engaged in the deception of the American people in order to go to war in Iraq. Would you sign it?
It's not for...
Why not, if not?
I would certainly not sign a petition where the charge was this deception, because every political leader deceives his public. That's the way politicians work to assemble majorities. They have to deceive some part of the majority they assemble. So, no, we have to think very hard about how to strengthen international justice. I am in favor of trials like the trials at The Hague for criminals in the former Yugoslavia. And I'm in favor of the trials going on in Sierra Leone and outside of Rwanda for leaders of the genocide there. But these institutions have to be strengthened, and we need to create we need to create not only the fact, but also the appearance of impartial justice. Now, and then we have some very hard cases. Consider the case of Pinochet. There was a transition from military dictatorship to democracy in Chile. And the transition was peaceful. And the condition of peacefulness was an amnesty for the leaders of the military regime, many of whom were certainly guilty of torture and murder. But that was the condition of the peaceful transition. And then a Spanish judge with a political agenda wanted to bring Pinochet to trial. And there were a lot of people around the world who thought this was a great idea. And certainly this was a man who deserved to be put on trial. But the Chilean people had made a deal, and that deal had enabled them to move peacefully to a genuinely democratic regime. And I would not want a judge like that Spanish judge with a political agenda to try to upset that deal. I think that that would be, again, for prudential reasons, because we hope for future peaceful transitions, which will often hang on amnesty for the tyrants. And when that is the condition of a peaceful transition, I would rank peace over justice.
Sort of a similar related question. You say you are in favor of these mechanisms of international justice, but an institution like the International Criminal Court does have the potential, because of its wide-ranging jurisdiction, to just sort of swoop in and affect the political calculations by trying political leaders. So I'm wondering if you think it's positive to have the ICC as this permanent, wide-reaching institution, or not?
Right. I think the United States should have joined the ICC and should be participating in its deliberations. But I am very skeptical about an effort to create international justice by moving only on the judicial front and not on the legislative and executive fronts, because then you get situations like what happened recently in the Sudan, where I believe it's the ICC brought indictments against the leader of the Sudan, who then promptly launched reprisals against the people of Darfur. And there was no international agency that was able to protect the people that was against the reprisals of the president of the Sudan. So I would look for balanced progress. If we are to move towards some international regime of justice, it has to include, you have to be able to protect the people who you make vulnerable by your indictments, and you have to be able to, you have to establish some kind of a balance of powers within the international community. But when I look at a situation like Darfur or Rwanda, it seems clear to me that what is crucially necessary is not judicial powers, but executive powers. Executive action is what's necessary in a place like Darfur, and not judicial action, which is mostly just talk.
Thank you, Professor Walzer. I also have a slightly similar question. I think you maybe have already half answered it, but A while back now, George W. Bush was in Montreal on his speaking tour, and a group of people had gathered outside the center where he was speaking to demand his arrest and be dragged before the ICC. So my question is whether we, as foreigners who have not or did not live directly under his presidency, but have arguably been affected by the policies of the Bush administration, whether we have a role in indicting him and bringing him before an international court, as he isn't on American territory but on Canadian, or whether that in itself would also raise the stakes for doing so.
Yes, well, I'm not sure I want to give advice to Canadian citizens about how to act politically. If there were a powerful political movement in the United States committed to shutting down Guantanamo, ending rendition, repudiating torture even more clearly than the Obama people have done, if there were a movement of that sort, I would ask you to support it. I am an internationalist in my political commitments, in the sense that I believe we owe support to each other's political struggles. But there isn't a movement of that sort in my country. So I'm not sure what you should be doing here. You should be seeking justice of some sort for Canadian citizens who were abused by the Bush administration. Exactly what form that justice should take, I really am not sure.
So thank you. Oh, are you? Okay, I'll get the other one.
We had to work out a problem of justice here. First, I note that your lecture was in part about another sense of trying political leaders, namely political leaders who are trying on our nerves, what we should do with them. I didn't think you quite addressed the point about Milosevic. Milosevic was democratically elected in a regime in which he was democratically and was arrested by a democratic regime. And it sounded in your talk like the only criterion that was relevant was whether it's an ongoing democratic government that can, as you put it, send its leaders home. Yet you seem to endorse sending the Balkan war criminals to trial. So I'm not quite sure if there's an argument that I'm missing. I would suggest that there is a difference, namely in the gravity of the crimes involved. Unlike some of the people who've put questions to you, I don't think that the gravity of the alleged crimes against the Bush administration justify putting those leaders on trial, whereas they do in the case of Milosevic, mass murder, mass rape, and so forth. I just note an irony. The two things that the Bush administration is accused of that people want to put their leaders on trial for is, one, overthrowing a regime which itself was a regime which had perpetrated mass murder, and then those leaders were put on trial in the new regime installed in Iraq, which turns out to be, at the moment, the only struggling but functioning democracy in the Arab world. All of that irrespective of what one thinks about that war. Just noting an irony. And the second irony is that the harsh interrogation of accused convicts, accused arrestees of Al-Qaeda were people who belonged to an organization which had just perpetrated a mass crime against American citizens and which has an ideology of killing Jews and crusaders and other infidels everywhere. So I think that it's those ironies and the difference in the gravity between the Bush administration's crimes and the ex-Yugoslav leaders that makes the difference.
Okay, we probably have a disagreement about harsh interrogation, but I am inclined to accept your view that the crimes of the Bush administration, which I think were crimes, don't reach the level of Milosevic's crimes. But I also would call into question the whether Serbia was, by any reasonable definition, a functioning democracy before the overthrow of Milosevic. Many of these formerly communist regimes continue still, as in Belarus today, to rule with elections that are not elections in our sense, and where there isn't a functioning, lively civil society that can generate genuinely democratic debate. So I thought of the decision by the Serbs to turn Milosevic over by the new Serbian government as something like the decision by French revolutionaries to put Louis on trial.
Thank you very much for your talk, Professor Walzer. It was very interesting. If democracy in part hinges on the support of its people, and a democratic system owes something to its people and has accountability to its people, then doesn't it owe it something when it systematically strips its citizenry of human rights, such as in the case of Guantanamo Bay? So we saw so many people on very little evidence taken into custody, tortured, without trial, held for inordinate amount of time, and then we don't hold the political authorities accountable for that. It seems like in the best interest of democracy, we would want to ensure that they're held accountable, because if a democracy, a democratic authority is accountable to its people, when it harms its people, it should be held accountable.
We do hold them accountable. They have to campaign for re-election every 2 years, every 4 years. That's the way democracies hold their leaders accountable. I don't think I have a general argument against substituting judicial procedures for elections, for democratic politics. I think there is, among many of the people who defend judicial procedures as the way to go, there is an active dislike of politics. After all, in politics, you're always reaching inconclusive decisions. And in trials, you're reaching a verdict, a verum dictum, of true speech. A trial ends in a definitive way. A democratic political process never ends in a definitive way. But that's accused terrorists. How should we treat them? And there are two choices in the law today. We can treat them as prisoners of war, which means benevolent quarantine for the duration, and the duration could be a very long time. But that's what prisoners of war are subjected to. They're not released until the end, but they have rights as prisoners of war. Or we can treat them as accused criminals and give them all the benefits of what Condorcet described, that he wanted the king to get, all of the benefits of our judicial process. Now, it's possible to argue that if we are going to be confronted, and then the Bush people had a third option, the illegal combatant, which is an amazing legal status because it has no rights whatsoever. not the rights of a prisoner of war and not the rights of an accused criminal. But there is an argument that can be made that we need now a third status in this struggle against terrorism. And it would have to be a status with rights. And maybe the rights would not be benevolent quarantine for the duration, because the duration might be too long. And maybe the rights would not be a full legal process, because often the evidence is very hard to collect. And we know people are dangerous, or we think they are dangerous, very dangerous, and we can't convict them in an American or a Canadian or an English court. That's a political argument. What status? Should we call them prisoners of war? Should we call them criminals? Should we construct some new status with rights between those two? That's a political argument. It can't be settled by a court. It's got to be settled by citizens talking about it. And that it's not, if you decide to go one way or another, the recourse of the people who disagree can't be to go to court. It's got to be to continue the argument in the political arena.
As a quick follow-up, what about those who are wronged by their government? Should they be allowed to have legal recourse?
Those who are specifically wronged, yes. Yes, they should have legal recourse. They can sue the government. At the very least, they should get reparations, and there may be other things that they're entitled to. And that will, in part, be a judicial decision. I grant that. Right now, the U.S. Supreme Court is not allowing civil suits, and I think that's probably wrong. That civil suits are not like political justice. Civil suits, we know how to deal with civil suits.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to say thank you very much for the lecture. I personally enjoyed it a great deal. I had one question for you. You base a lot of your argument on prudential justifications drawn from democratic theory, but I'm wondering, does your argument still apply in the liberal democratic paradigm, where there's such an emphasis on taming political power through the rule of law, which implies a judiciary and judges who are going to hold political leaders accountable for when they break domestic and international law?
Well, we do hold political leaders accountable. If they take bribes, we bring them to court. We hold them accountable if they pursue their personal interests in a way that violate the law, and we should do that. But the concept of political crimes is highly debatable, because if you were to bring the former Vice President Cheney to trial in the United States, 50% of the people would think before the trial began that he was obviously guilty, and 50% of the people would think that this was obviously a political trial, motivated by partisan political reasons. And that's not a healthy condition. Now, in many criminal trials, there are disagreements about the way the decision should go, because trials get a lot of publicity. But we allow the court to settle criminal cases, and we allow the court to settle civil cases. I don't think the court would be able to settle political cases in a way that held the nation together.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Walzer, for your lecture. I just have one question. So let's say we have a political leader who's committed abuses after being elected, and there is a group of people that wants to put him or her on trial. What if the democratic process that brought this person to power had failed? What if it had been proven later on that it had been a fraudulent election, a rigged election, And at that point, would it then be appropriate to bring this person to trial? And furthermore, would it be wrong to repeat or risk to repeat another fraudulent election?
Well, yes, we should avoid fraudulent elections. It's interesting to think about the Clinton case. You know, there was a civil suit against Clinton brought by one of the women from Arkansas that he'd been involved with before he became president. And he argued that this woman had a perfect right to bring a civil suit, but not against a sitting president. He wanted the suit to be postponed until after he left office, and then it could go forward. That was his legal argument. And that's a hard question, whether you want a sitting president or prime minister to be harassed by, as they could well be, by by a succession, a series of civil suits, often brought by with the help of political opponents. So there might be an argument for saying you have to wait until after the term of office, and then the suit goes forward exactly as it would for any other citizen. But again, if the issue is something that the country is in the middle of a political debate about, then I don't think a judicial process is the right. I've said this so often now. I don't think it's the right way to go.
Okay, I'm just trying to think of maybe different ways to come at your argument for a tempered shield of immunity around holders of high office, maybe a way of making that argument that's not so strictly exclusively on prudential grounds. So I wonder what you have to say about this. So it's part of we could say it's part of the nature of political leadership in a democratic society, that political leaders find themselves in situations of tragic choice, find themselves in situations so difficult that it's impossible to imagine them coming out of the choice situation without dirty hands. So I'm wondering if you think that that's maybe an argument that belongs under the auspices of the argument as you've made. I think it's one that you'll probably have some sympathy to.
Yes. Yes, right. I do have sympathy for that view. I would think that Abraham Lincoln's decision to suspend habeas corpus was a decision of that sort. I guess I agree that when political leaders are forced to get their hands dirty, we want them to know that they've gotten their hands dirty. I mean, what we hold most against the Bush administration is that they think they have clean hands. But we want them to know that their hands are dirty, and we want some way of some public expression of that knowledge. Let me give an example. It's not, historical examples are always iffy, but in World War II, the British bombed German cities. Not even aiming at military targets, but aiming quite specifically at residential areas. And the architect of that policy was Air Marshal Harris, who became known as Bomber Harris. After the war, the pilots of Bomber Command, well, the pilots of Fighter Command, the fighter pilots that saved England during the Blitz, were honored with a memorial in Westminster Abbey. And the pilots of Bomber Command were not honored because there was this sense that this policy was morally wrong, even though some people had thought that Nazism could not be defeated in any other way. Bomber Harris in contrast to all the other generals, was not knighted after the war, and he left England, went to South Africa. So I thought that was an illustration of how you might acknowledge the wrongs that have been done by political or military leaders, and maybe even force them, with Bomber Harris it didn't work, force them to acknowledge the wrongs themselves without going to the courts.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very rich and stimulating discussion. As I listened to the discussion, the lecture, the question, I sense a disconnection between various theoretical approaches and worldviews. I don't think that we can get an answer to this. On the one hand, we have the philosophical approach that starts with individual human rights or utilitarian suffering that says very clearly that this is where you begin. If people have been wronged heinously, mutilated, tortured, and so on, they deserve something done about that, and people will not be satisfied with a political, if you like, solution to that. On the other hand, I'm also very sympathetic to the more political theory approach that says a healthy democracy must be kept going. Now, there we come into empirical generalizations that are very difficult to sort out, because it's true, as you say, that if there is always the danger of people ripping each other apart, that this undermines democracy. However, I get the sense that the reason that so many people feel democracy is breaking down is simply because these kinds of horrifying wrongs are going on and nothing is being done about it. So the reason I don't expect an answer to this, the meta question on all of this, is how we can possibly get the right kind of evidence for what really keeps democracy healthy, because many people feel that it's breaking down simply because these kinds of things are going on and the forms of redress that are being offered do not really get at the core of the issue. So how do we sort out the various approaches? How could we possibly know what will keep democracy strong and healthy?
Well, what keeps democracy strong and healthy is the active engagement of its citizens. And in my country, the problem is not that the members of the Bush administration are sitting in their homes, in their retirement homes. That's not the problem. The problem is that having elected a president who promised to end rendition and et cetera, the country, and the people who elected him, sat back and waited for him to do it without providing anything like the kind of political support from the base that he needs if he's going to do it. Because politics doesn't work from, democratic politics does not work from the top down. Far better than trials for Cheney would be a political movement committed to ending the policies of the Bush administration in a strong and definitive way. And that political movement just doesn't exist. People gave their email addresses to the Obama campaign, and they even went out and distributed election materials and knocked on doors, and then they went home. And they thought, what a wonderful day. There's somebody in Washington who's going to do everything we want. But he can't. What made the New Deal possible was the labor movement of the 1930s. What made what made the 60s possible was the civil rights movement. And the United States right now does not have anything like that. And Obama is not will not succeed in the absence of that kind of politics. The answer has to lie in politics. It does not lie in the courts. The courts are our least democratic institution. And this is a major problem. Think about the fight, think about the fight for choice, for the fight for abortion rights. There was a political process in the works that was being fought state by state in the United States to legalize abortion. And then there was the court decision, and that just shut down all political action, except on the right. The court decision galvanized an anti-abortion politics, but it quieted any pro-choice politics. And so you can win in the courts. All you need to win in the courts is a clever lawyer and a good brief. But to win politically, you need a social movement. You need a mobilization of citizens. And in the absence of that, the courts can't help us. Yeah, sure.
Go ahead. Well, I'd like to apologize beforehand that I'm not particularly good at anything, including public speaking.
Including?
Okay, sorry, I'd like to apologize beforehand. I'm not particularly good at public speaking or anything of the sort, so bear with me. My question is about, my voice sounds like that. Okay. You should go ahead.
Hi, this has been a very interesting meeting. Thank you very much for that. You speak a lot about how we bring our political leaders to justice is through the election process. However, I would just like to know what you suggest for the individuals who suffer as a result of from an American president, but who do not have the power to take part in an election. So, for example, the innocent citizens of Iraq who suffered under President Bush, how do they get justice?
Well, look, as a point was made by a gentleman over here, the regime we overthrew in Iraq was responsible for the mass murder of Kurds and Shiites on a scale vastly greater than anything the United States has done in Iraq. I was against that war precisely because I thought we were imposing risks on the Iraqi people that we had no right to impose on them. But 60% of the country is Shiite, and they desperately wanted Saddam Hussein overthrown by anybody who would do it. And 20% of the country is Kurdish, and they desperately wanted Saddam Hussein overthrown. Had there been a vote before we went in, we did it so badly that now the vote would go the other way. Had there been a vote before, there would have been overwhelming Iraqi support for that war. Well, of course, there couldn't have been a vote, given the character of the regime. But it doesn't make sense for people who said not a word about Saddam's atrocities to condemn the American war. You need people who have a record, people who are on record as standing up against Saddam, they can criticize what we did. But the people who marched in 2003 against the war, many of those political groupings had been supporters of Saddam. So that's not an argument. We owe reparations to the people of Iraq because we did so many things wrong after invading their country. But the actual invasion, though I was against it, it wasn't the worst thing we did by far.
Want to try again?
I apologize for last time. I'll just cut to the point. Get to the chase. What? Okay, how would you view a trial that's in any sort of either natural law or legal or any other sort of view on law whatsoever, completely ignored and threw out any sort of concept of justice whatsoever, and how that reflect on the government and the entire process itself? The point I'm referring to is, I'm glad you referred to it before, the Tokyo trials. There were units of Japanese scientists in northern China that did some awful, horrible human experiments on hundreds of thousands of people and killed thousands and thousands of, nearly all of them, with poison gas and medical experimentation. But after the war, at these trials, that they were completely, not only dishonored, they were rewarded for these actions by the United States military, many of them gaining United States citizenship and continuing their work they started in the Japanese imperial government. And there was absolutely complete acknowledgement of what they've done by the legal process, and it would be considered illegal under Japanese law at the time, the puppet Chinese government law at the time, and American law. And how would a procedure that completely ignored any sort of concept of legal education or the similar trials going on in Nuremberg about human rights, how does that speak upon the legal system that was employed in both areas simultaneously and by the governments who employed it? Would this not stain the entire process?
Okay. I don't think you have any problem with public speaking.
Okay.
I don't know the details of the trials or lack of trials of Japanese
They were trials.
scientists.
They presented their arguments, and then they were.
But I certainly agree that that doctors and scientists who conduct medical experiments like those conducted in China and in Germany have to be punished, and that is. You can invoke natural law, you can invoke human rights, you can invoke international law. You need to make more of an effort than we made in Japan to make the language of the indictments comprehensible to the public in front of which these people are being indicted. But I certainly agree that those people should not have been released. And I know the United States made deals with German scientists and with Japanese scientists after World War II in preparation for the Cold War, which were not good deals.
So would you say that this reflected any sort of ideological focus of the United States? It was all political expedience, preparation militarily for the Cold War? Sorry,
No, countries have mixed motives because there are many people acting on behalf. A lot of the lawyers in Tokyo really believed in the integrity of the process that they were creating and in the importance of vindicating a natural law jurisdiction. And they worked very hard to do it right. If you read the dissent of the Indian judge, it becomes pretty clear that they didn't succeed. But they were free of any expediential motivations.
Mr. Walzer, thank you for allowing me to speak. I just have to disagree with your statement that no public official expects to enter jail after leaving office. I feel like it is part of law and the rule of law to constrain political action. And even though leaders may make decisions, political decisions in the name of the common good, these decisions can and often do lead to political crimes. And these crimes not only violate international law and domestic jurisprudence, but they often violate our supreme commitments under our Constitution. And just thinking of international law, I want to draw your attention to the Convention Against Torture, which I'm sure you're aware of, that it defines torture as an act committed by or with the acquiescence of a public official. And it seems to me that having a Convention Against Torture would be inconsistent if we can't hold these public officials to account. And you state that you want to repudiate leaders in the strongest way. I would argue that the way to do this is through law in order to end the culture of impunity associated with this crime, something which your argument of political accountability will not end, because the consequence of which will continue to elect officials who are willing to commit crimes in our name, knowing that they won't be held legally responsible.
I really don't, why this extraordinary faith in the law? In the United States today, if Cheney were brought to trial and convicted by a court, he would appeal to the Supreme Court, where the conviction would be reversed. So we know that because there is a 5-4 majority of judges whom he appointed or who have his political views. The courts are also political institutions. I don't understand what. So imagine that process, and the end is a 5-4 vote. It would be more than 5-4. It might even be unanimous vote of the court that this was not a justiciable case, and that Cheney was not guilty. And would that end it for you? Would that be the end of the story, or would you then campaign for a new Supreme Court?
If the trial failed, I would say that we should at least try, because it sends a message, especially a political message, that leaders who commit crimes in our names, we will at least try to.
But suppose they are acquitted.
But your argument is that we should hold them politically accountable by not electing them to office. But when we elect people to office, we don't know that they're going to go out and torture people. So it's not retrospective. So I don't see how.
No, but I'm asking you. Suppose we had these trials, and the end result was an acquittal. Would you then say, "Okay, we've done it. They're innocent"?
No.
No, you wouldn't. You would then look for a political way of changing the Supreme Court.
No, it would open the door to universal jurisdiction.
There won't be universal jurisdiction in the absence of a world state, and we are centuries away from a world state.
Why don't you have the same confidence in the American judicial system that Justice Jackson did? Justice Jackson stood up and said, no, we must have this trial because we don't want to be like the Nazis. And he had confidence that it would work. And then he put that confidence into play, and they had a relatively fair trial.
Right.
Why don't you think the American judicial system is capable of having a fair trial? We have it in Canada. I mean, you have it in the United States. We have a Supreme Court that's been appointed by different governments, but when we send cases before that Supreme Court, we don't expect our judges to act politically motivated. We expect them to follow the law and to give legal reasons for what they do. And the Supreme Court in the United States is perfectly capable of doing that. In fact, they do it all the time. So why do you think in a particular case, if there's a fair trial according to the law in the United States with evidence and good judges and good lawyers working on behalf of both sides, why don't you think your Supreme Court is capable of making a fair judicial decision? What makes you think that they're incapable of doing that? You have such little respect for your American system.
Right. They have failed to do that in every case brought before them for several years now.
Now on the detainee system, where the Supreme Court has on a number of occasions told Mr. Bush that he was wrong.
Right, right.
I think it's time, unfortunately, and we've had a long time with Professor Walzer. I'm sorry to those of you who weren't able to ask your questions, but now I just very much like everyone to thank Professor Walzer for a very